Hello again, friends. This is a very important tutorial. It will lead you through the equimaps interactive indicator that is probably the most sensitive one on measuring the burden of health inequity. That is, if you go into the chapters of equimaps indicators, the one on proportion of avoidable deaths. What does this mean? It means which are the countries that have, if positive, a proportion of deaths that were in excess of what the standard models that we saw in the previous tutorial of healthy, replicable, and sustainable models had. Now, these mortality or survival rates of the healthy, replicable, and sustainable models could be feasible for all, and we've applied those mortality rates to the population groups by 5-year age groups of the rest of the world, and by comparing the expected mortality and the observed mortality, we see, first of all, countries that have mortality rates in different age groups above those that would be feasible for all, and other group of countries that have mortality rates below. So we have healthier countries than standards and, let's say, unhealthier countries than standards. And we can measure that in the proportion of deaths which would be avoidable if all countries had this global health equity. Now let's look at this proportion in these different groups. We have selected here only the 3 main age groups under 15 years, both for both sexes, female and male, 15 to 65, let's say the productive age groups, and then 65 to 80, somehow the retirement age groups. And we also have indicators and maps for all ages, both sexes, female and male. Now let's start with what happens with the proportion of deaths under the age of 15, which would have been avoided if there was global health equity, which is all countries had at least the mortality rates or its alternative equivalent survival rates of the healthy, replicable, and sustainable models. So this is how it shows. We've put here in positive those countries that have a positive proportion, which means some of their deaths would have been avoided. We see countries with above 0.7, which means over 70% of deaths under the age of 15 would have been avoided by global health equity. And look at how the world shows in year 2007. We can scroll down the time bar to the 1950s, and we see here that in the 1950s, those countries with the highest proportion of deaths that would have been avoided by global health equity were in sub-Saharan Africa, also India, and then Madagascar. And let's now narrow this second group of countries by saying that we want to see how countries that had between 0.4 0.7, that is 40 to 70% of deaths, and then let's see here countries that had between 0.2 and 0.4, and then countries that had anything above 0.01, for instance, and then countries that had negative. Now you see here how the world looked like in 1950s. The blue countries are those that had an excess of mortality due to the global burden of health inequity, and the darkest those that had the highest proportion. We can play and see how the world evolved in terms of the proportion of deaths under 15, which should have been avoided. Okay, we can see these also for the other age groups. For instance, how did this look like in girls under 15, and this is for instance for the Russian Federation, how has it been evolving, or we can see it here in Chad, or we can click different countries or even the States. We can also do it for any of the other age groups, 15 to 65. Now let's look, for instance, at countries where we know there were fundamental changes. What happened with adult male over 15 in Russia between 1950 and 2007. And let's click on that and let's play and see what happened. You can see how after the late 80s, Russia had a very high increase in mortality, and that's in the 90s after the collapse of the Soviet Union and everything that went with it. Now let's look, for instance, at the same indicator but for females in the productive age group, and how did AIDS affect them, for instance, in South Africa. Here's where you see all the indicators, but let's scroll down the bar and let's see through time what happened with South Africa. You see also that at the turn of the 90s there's a very high increase. Well, there was a downtrend before, but it goes up and up again because of most likely AIDS. This is the same thing that happens with Zimbabwe, Botswana, even Namibia, Mozambique. The heavily affected countries by AIDS have this high increase after the 90s. You can also see how countries have evolved in how countries look like in the negative shape, which is countries with negative, if you want, burden of health inequity, which is mortality rates below the standards, and those countries that have higher, and the difference between them. You can also see how these two groups, basically those countries with a certain degree of burden of health equity, this group, and with those in a privileged situation with mortality rates below the standards, and how does the country look like, and so the world look like. And as I said, you can do this with all the age groups and sex. Let's look at the consolidate figure of all ages, all, let's say, proportion of deaths of all ages. In fact, all ages recorded in the UN Statistical and Demographic Division, which are those below 80, those deaths below 80 that would have been avoided if there was there was global health equity, which means all countries had at least the healthy, feasible and sustainable standards. And this is how it looks like. And let's again scroll down the bar and see the distribution of the countries in the world with a certain degree of burden of health inequity. You can also look at it by horizontal charts and again see how it looks like. You can also see in a given country how has it been evolving. You can also do it, as I said, in a line. This is how it looks in Russia, South Africa, Nigeria, the States. It was always negative, but with not so negative. After the 60s you can have your own conclusions. And in fact there are specific age groups. This is more precise if you look at our interactive tool of interactive charts and database, where you can see it in a more precise way in 5-year age groups instead of these 15 to 16, 65 and over 65. You can also try to correlate in this tool how do for instance, the all proportion of deaths that would have been avoided under the age of 50, both male and female, and correlated, for instance, with a basic indicator like GDP per capita. Let's reduce these upper threshold, 50,000, and let's look at countries according to a bubble size reflecting their total countries, sorry, let's put this in a lower scale so we can see it better. This keeps changing. And this is how it looked in 2007. And this is how it looked like in the 50s. You can see here that countries that had some burden of health inequity were in the lower level of GDP per capita, whilst others in 2007, sorry, this keeps going back to the upper limit, were here. So obviously poorer countries with lower resources, particularly those under this level of resources, seem to be having higher burden of health inequity. But there are countries with a low level of resources, even here overshadowed by China, which have a negative burden of health inequity. They're healthy countries. So these are the countries like the standard ones we have identified in the global health equity models. But of course you also see that countries with very high GDP per capita, most of them are on the negative side. There are some exceptions here of wealthy countries, but with many avoidable deaths. And as I said, this has not always been like that, and you can see countries with high GDP that are in this higher level because they are not efficient internally. You can also see that in a more precise way in certain age groups, for instance, in those that are in the reproductive health age, particularly women under their 65 age group. Let's again see this how it looks like, and you will see some countries with high GDP but which remain in this upper size with very efficient, even the states at certain level have mortality rates above the standard models for women between 15 and 65. So these are some of the features you can use in our StatPlanet equimaps tool for this very critical dimension or chapter of indicators, which is the proportion of deaths which would have been avoided had there been global health equity. Thank you.